When I was a couple weeks short of my 70th birthday, I started thinking about my mother's mother, who lived to be 100, and her mother, who lived to be 102, and my father, who lived to be 90, longer than anyone we had ever heard of in his family. I began to think that maybe our generation could be the first to routinely live to be 100. When I talked about this at family dinner one night, my granddaughter, who was 5, said,
"What are you going to do for the next 30 years, Grandpa?"
Hello, I'm Dr. Janet Price.
And I'm Gregg Kaloust. And we are Oldish. And this is our podcast, Oldish.
If you're oldish or know someone who is, please join us every week for conversations amongst ourselves
And our special guests
about what it means to be oldish in the 21st century.
If you ever wonder whether you're getting old, you're oldish. What are you going to do for the next 30 minutes? Hi, I'm Gregg, and I'm Oldish. My co-host Dr. Janet Price and I have a New Year's resolution of publishing new episodes on a more regular basis, hopefully every week. Well, no sooner resolved than real life intervenes. So we decided that this week we'd republish one of our earlier episodes, Oldish on Everest, with our first guest, Chris Balch, with whom I went to Mount Everest Base Camp when we were both 65. This has been one of our most popular episodes. When I listened to it again, I discovered how much I've learned about editing with the tool we use, Descript. So I decided to re-edit it. It's almost like a new episode. If you've already listened to it the first time, almost 3 years ago, pretend you didn't and listen again.
Hello, my name is Janet, and I am Oldish.
Hi, I'm Gregg, and I'm old. Today we're going to be welcoming to our Oldish podcast my dear friend and companion in the mountains, Chris Balch. And we're going to talk today with him about being together in the mountains. And we were in the mountains for a specific purpose. Chris and I met back in 2015 on our way to Mount Everest Base Camp in Nepal as a way to raise funds and awareness to find a medical solution to a problem that afflicts my grandson and the son of some very close friends of Chris, Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy. And so we went to Mount Everest together with a number of other people to get some awareness in the world and also to raise some funds, which we're successful at. We'll talk about that. So Chris, welcome, Mr. Chris Balch.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, I'm certainly glad to hear that. So, Chris, could you start off by telling us about what got you onto that airplane to go to Nepal back in 2015?
Well, it's kind of a longer lead-in. Back in 2013, I retired from a 40-year teaching career, and I was kind of thrilled to do so because I knew that particular fall, the fall of 2013, I would actually have the opportunity to go backpacking and see the autumn colors close up firsthand again for the first time in many, many years, because I'd always been in school during that time. So I did. And that short trip, I actually dedicated to the Hope for Gus Foundation. I hiked about 100 miles on the Long Trail in Vermont, and I raised about $5,000, which really surprised me because I didn't think that people would be that supportive, but people were terrific. So the next year I did the Long Trail from end to end, and that was about 270 miles. It was 35 days, and I went the whole time without a shower, so I probably smelled pretty awful by the end. But on that trip, I raised almost $20,000 for Hope for Gus, and so I felt like I was on a roll in the fall of 2014 after I'd finished the long. Steve and Tanya Dreer, who are the head honchos of Hope for Gus, invited me to go to Everest. And I had always wanted to go to Mount Everest, but had felt that the window on being able to go and climb the actual mountain had closed when my 50s were left behind. And I was a little bit too oldish to perhaps climb to the summit of Everest. But the idea of going and seeing the Himalayas and combining that with such a wonderful cause really kind of resonated with me. I had no idea about the group of people I was going to meet. And oftentimes I don't really do great in groups. Sometimes I just tend to be the odd man out and tend to keep to myself. But I didn't think that I was going to really be focusing on the group of people as much as it ended up being. The trip to Everest was really inspired by a long-term love of the mountains and a really deep love for Steve and Tanya Dreer and their little son, Gus. I was kind of prompted to do it, and then I met you, and that has been a great pleasure in my life to have gotten to know you. You have been a great friend and a wonderful mentor in ways, and I feel like I've been your mentor in ways too, so it's been a really nice friendship.
And as you know, I feel the same way. Could you tell us a little bit about Duchenne and Hope for Gus? I'd like to use this podcast in the same way that we used going to Everest.
And I'm just going to jump in for a second, just as I hear things that kind of reflect the focus of our podcast. So I'm hearing that this was like a post-career endeavor. And so just the kind of excitement for me to be reminded that our life doesn't end when our career, as we think of it, ends, and that this whole new world opened up to you around hiking and then pairing hiking with passions for helping. And also the idea when you just mentioned that you weren't sure if you were too oldish to get to the summit, but that you felt like you could get to a base camp, just made me think about that at this time in our lives that we can be pairing realities with possibilities. And that for you, that was what you did. And I also just wanted to ask you, did you feel oldish at the time? It sound, were you, when you were thinking about joining this Hope for Gus climb, were you feeling oldish, or how oldish, or, is there any way to even talk about that or comment on that?
Sure. I wasn't feeling oldish, actually, and I still don't. I guess I do and I don't. Certainly when I climb out of bed first thing in the morning, I have to do a few stretches so that I can move without discomfort during the day. But it works, and everything still works. And I'm, knock on wood, very luckily, I'm not on any big medications. I'm on one very small one that I'm actually weaning off of right now. And I feel good. So I don't really feel oldish. I'm still a young man trapped in a body that is aging, but I don't feel like an old man, trapped in anything. I would say, in terms of talking a little bit about Duchenne, one of the things I experienced when I retired that was very unexpected was that my world got bigger. I really kind of thought that as I retired, my world was going to shrink and I was going to spend more time at home and sort of focus on boat building, which is something that I do for fun and profit, and that I wasn't really going to be as involved in different communities as I was as a full-time teacher. Instead, I experienced that my world got bigger, that I actually am involved in more things with more people across more communities than I ever have been in the past. And at the same time, it occurs to me that the people that are afflicted with Duchenne, that they're struggling with that, their worlds are getting smaller. And so when I can couple some of my experiences in the greater world and communicate them to the people that have Duchenne, I think it's really kind of a special combination. One of the things that happens with Duchenne is it is a disease that essentially causes muscular atrophy. And so the muscles become smaller over time and less capable. They are unable to regenerate. They are sometimes replaced with scar tissue. And scar tissue will have all kinds of bad effects, particularly when it becomes scar tissue of the heart muscle and things like that. So over time, people with Duchenne lose their ability to walk. They end up in wheelchairs. They end up losing their ability to really move very well at all. And then ultimately, they pass away from this muscular degeneration when they get to a point where their circulatory system is not functioning properly, or there are a number of different ways it can actually happen. But it's really kind of a tragic disease. And while there are some treatments and trials, nothing that has really truly been effective has come down the pike yet, though. I would say that with the CRISPR gene therapies and the trials that are starting to come into play with those, there is some real hope, and hope that just a few years ago we all thought was probably 25 years away. I would say now is much closer. There's a good chance that some of this generation of people with Duchenne muscular dystrophy will survive and will even recover to a certain extent if their bodies are able to start producing dystrophin and eliminating scar tissue and reproducing muscle. So it would be absolutely glorious to see Griffin, Greg's grandson, and Gus, Steve and Tanya's son, get out of a wheelchair again someday and be able to walk on their own and skip and just be happy and joyous. So that would be a wonderful thing to see.
In the show notes for this episode, we'll have some links to the Hope for Gus Foundation where people can get more information and detail about what Duchenne is and what it means. So how did it feel to be undertaking something huge like going to Everest? I don't want to underestimate how huge it is to go to Everest Base Camp, especially at our age. And we were both 65 when we took off the first time. We've been back since, but we're both 65. And my impression is that a lot of people feel like 65, I'm not doing that. One of my favorite stories is from when we went again in 2017. We were stopped somewhere to catch our breath on the trail, and I was approached by a gentleman who appeared to be from India, and he asked if he could take his picture with me. And I said, why? And he said, because my wife told me that I was too old to do this. And so I want to have a picture with somebody who's really old to show when I get back home. I think that's probably is a fairly common take on it. It's like, so how did it feel to get on the plane and say, I'm actually doing this?
And I just want to jump in and say, maybe that is one of our roles as people who are oldish, is to model. In fact, I feel pretty strongly about that as our generation works to redefine life and what life looks like at this point and this moment. We are modeling and showing, it's not about age, as you were saying, Chris. It's about other things. That's a lovely story.
That's a great story. So I don't see getting old as a disability. I don't see it as a disease or anything that really prevents me from doing the things that I want to do. I don't perhaps make plans that are 25 or 30 years in the future because I'm realistic. But I will make plans for 5 years and even 10 years into the future. I've been very lucky health-wise, and getting on that plane was, there was some trepidation. I wondered mostly about the elevation and how it was going to impact me. And as it turned out, it was my biggest obstacle. But in terms of seeing those mountains that I've always wanted to see, the Himalayan mountains, I think that there was a balance between sort of trepidation, excitement, and just pure wonder as to how it was all going to go. And I think that just because we become oldish, we don't really lose a taste for adventure and for new things and for trying to take some big bites out of life. And that we do have an obligation to not let ourselves fall apart just because it's easier in this culture and our society to do so, but to push ourselves to be the best that we can be right up to the end. And if that's modeling, if that is sort of setting an example, that's fine. But really, it's mostly, I think, for ourselves and perhaps for our immediate family members that we need to do that. And in other ways that we can contribute to the greater good and the greater culture, I think that's fine. But certainly getting on the plane, I think getting off the plane in Lukla was where it really came real. And picking up my little day pack and walking just about 30 feet away across the tarmac to where we were going to take our first picture. And I sat down and said, I'm out of breath. We were at, I forget exactly what the elevation was, but 9,000 something feet. The plane ride there, that was actually our first one was a helicopter ride. And it was a little bit harrowing because we got a lot closer to ridge tops than I would have liked. And I'm not really very comfortable in helicopters anyway. But then it really felt real. And seeing those mountains as we were sitting down in the helicopter and just looking at them and saying, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? And then I said what I always say to myself, which is just one day at a time and do the best you can and it will be good enough. And then I think on our Whitney trip, we a year later, we came up with a different one, which is how do you eat an elephant?
Yeah.
And the answer is one bite at a time, but it's much the same thing.
I remember as we approached Everest Base Camp, which was, I think, 17,500 feet above sea level, the one step at a time was, I think that's among the most clearest times I've felt that. It's like just get one foot in front of the other, because you put one foot in front of the other and then have to stop and try to catch your breath, and then take another step and stop and try to catch your breath. And that was a big issue, certainly there. I agree with you about the feeling of seeing the mountains like that. I'd always dreamed of going to the mountains. Never crossed my mind ever that I would go to Mount Everest Base Camp. I looked at people going to the summit of Mount Everest, and I knew that's nuts. That made no sense to me at all, and even less so after we got to base camp, which is halfway, and you're just getting started. But to keep going after that, I wasn't going anywhere after that, and I know you weren't going any higher after that. No. So there is a point at which I think I was saying, I can't go any higher than this. I can't go any harder than this. But I kept reminding myself that we had a mission. I think having a mission makes a big difference. I've noticed that in myself just in the last while, having a mission that is self-directed more in retirement than it was before, but it's still having a mission. And we got the mission of, in 2015, no matter what it takes, we're going to get Tanya to base camp. We're going to get the flag that we took along with the names of all the boys with Duchenne on it. We're going to get that to base camp no matter what it takes. And it took a lot. It definitely took a lot from all of us. But it was, I have a mission. I'm going to complete the mission. And that was something that I didn't expect when we started out, that having a mission, having one step further to go. If you don't have any place to go, you don't need that one further step, I think.
Well, let me just add a little bit to what you just said, because you've provoked thoughts in me too, which is that I think that after retirement, as you become oldish, you can't go through life not having a mission. You need to have at least one mission, and having many is more fun. It keeps things a lot more lively. I run into people sometimes who I either taught with or I worked with down through the years, and they always ask me, "How are you?" with great concern. Are you keeping busy? Are you keeping busy? And what they're saying is, now that your life is essentially without any value whatsoever, are you able to distract yourself from that fact? And I get so insulted, because the way I really see it is, I don't know how I ever found time to work.
Yeah, that's really is how it feels to me. Now, Janet is not retired, and we'll be talking at some point, not necessarily today, but in some episode of Oldishness, is Janet actually started her private practice when she was oldish. That's really mission-y. So we'll talk at some point about that. So I think Janet understands that pretty clearly. One of the things that I'd like to share with whoever might be listening here is, holy smokes, Everest Base Camp, you're up in the Himalayas. What was that like? What did it look like? How do you even do it? So, Chris, why don't you talk about that a little bit, and I'll throw in some things.
The day that we climbed above tree line was the day that we went to Farichi. And Farichi is a very small village nestled right into a valley that's more or less near the base of Everest. It's still a few miles away, but you're really getting there, but you're well above tree line. So the day we got there was the day that the Himalayas really sort of became wow land, where everywhere you looked, you just kind of went, wow, it's just unbelievable. And when the next morning, after we spent a real quiet night at Farichi that night, because we were all knocked out, dead tired. And then the next morning, we begged our guides to give us what they called a lazy day, which meant that we would not do a long day hike, because we would be at Farichi for a couple of days to acclimate to the change in elevation. And I got up and I hiked up the hill right behind our tea house and just stood on top of a low ridge. And everywhere I looked, there were just towering, incredible, beautiful mountains, snow-capped, covered with snow, not just snow-capped, but just covered with snow, and glaciers. and not a house in sight except for down in the valley right below at my feet. And it was just unbelievable wilderness, but it was also magnificence that I had never felt, never seen before. And on a very spiritual level, I felt like I was somehow close to creation. And it was magical. It was just magical. So when you're in that kind of a position, when you're standing someplace like that, when you're looking out over a vista like that, when you're experiencing something like that, you're not oldish. You're not any age. You just are you, and it is what it is, and you're there. And it's incredibly precious and wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's really beautiful. Chris, when you were saying that you feel like that this time in your life has been about pushing yourself to be the best you can be until the very end, and that I didn't say anything in that moment when you said that, Chris, because I was so touched by that. I just needed to let it sink in because it just feels like that is the experience of life, including in this time in our lives, especially. And then also I was just commenting on people that say, how are you? And how are you filling your time? And how, that this talk right now is an example of it's not about a line where our lives are not meaningful anymore, or there's nothing to look forward to or get excited about, that we're just filling our time until the end. And so that was all touching to me. I have one question, which is, Chris, as you were talking about looking out over the scene and seeing the mountains and feeling at this kind of spiritual moment and magical moment, do you think you would have experienced that differently if you had been doing that in your 20s or 30s?
Well, that's a great question. I have always loved the mountains, and I have spent rather an inordinate amount of time in them. But I would have to say that the experience is richer as you get older. And I think it's partly because you have a broader and a deeper perspective. I've seen mountains for many years all over the world. I've spent time in the Alps in France. I was at the Matterhorn once in Switzerland. And of course, I've done lots of mountains all across the United States. And it's not that I was contrasting those mountains to what I was seeing, but I was adding what I was seeing to that experience. And so in a way, I want to say it was icing on the cake, but that's kind of a simplification. Really, it was just adding a whole new experience, just a whole new sort of flavor to the entire package. And it's one of those things that kind of, it doesn't really come in through your eyes. It just comes in through your soul, and it becomes part of you, and it's there with you forevermore. And sometimes when I'm feeling very stressed or whatever, I will think about places that I've been as just a way to sort of reflect and regain a center and a calmness. And I often think of that brief period that I was standing up on top of that ridge behind the village in Forice. And just climbing up there, it was really a short climb. It was probably like 200 yards, but I was like practically dead by the time I got to the top. And so I was like bent over in what Greg used to jokingly call one of my heroic poses, where I wasn't actually heroic, I was gasping. But once I got my breath up and I stood up and I looked out, I was just overwhelmed by the beauty.
So one of the questions, and this might be rude, Chris, but when we got to Everest Base Camp, you were quite sick in 2015.
Oh, yeah.
And then when we went back in 2017, not only were we both still oldish, but we had the awareness of what it was going to be like left over from 2015 as we got higher and higher. And you made a decision before we got to base camp at Gorkshep, the last stop before we got to Everest Base Camp. You made a decision to not keep going because of how it was the first time, I think, as well as some other things maybe. How did it feel? I'm confronting this pretty much every day. How did it feel to not be able to do something that I used to be able to do, even though I really want to? How did that feel? And did you make any shifts in consciousness to be able to adapt to it?
That's a great question, Greg. So in the spring of 2017, well before we went, I discovered that I had a medical condition, and it really threw me for a loop. And I was pretty sick during a good part of that summer. and had physically mostly recovered by the time we went, but was still kind of reeling from just the whole thing happening. And I don't want to get into what it was particularly, but it was not good, and it could have been a lot worse than it was. I'm okay now, so I can be grateful for that. But I had lost some confidence just in my basic well-being that I have always had through my life. And so when I went to base camp that time in 2017, and I had my sleepless night when we were at the pyramid. I had a almost completely sleepless night that night because of the elevation sickness. And when I got up in the morning, I said, okay, last time I pushed myself and I went on after the sleepless night, and I survived it, but it was really, really, really uncomfortable and really miserable. And I thought about it and I said, well, part of being a team is that the team can get there even if a single member of the team can't. And I decided that I didn't want to push myself that hard. So it was a setback, yes. And I was disappointed, but I also felt like I made a realistic decision and an expedient one, but I also didn't feel like I was making a decision that was going to be for the rest of my life. I kind of felt like, okay, that means this time I don't do it, but if I come back here again in the future, I'll try again. And if I don't make it that time, maybe that's a message that the window's closed on that. But I don't feel like it was really a defeat. I felt like it was a strategic retreat at a time when that's probably what I really did need to do. So I've been okay with that decision. I've thought about that a lot. And I said, you can't win them all really does mean you can't win them all. And at some point, you got to learn how to accept the defeats that come our way, because they will. And then you have to move on, and you got to be able to deal with that as well as victory. So I think it was a good decision still. And of course, I'm disappointed I didn't get there and I wasn't part of the reading of the names into the wind, but it all happened without me. The important stuff still managed to all happen. And it wasn't critical that I was there. It was more critical that somebody from the team, that most of the team got there, and they did. So
I'm so moved by the themes of what is coming up, and how, Chris, what I'm hearing you say is around being oldish and needing to make some decisions that were about realistic potential, and also making peace with what that might look like, and also having an understanding of your place in all of that, and the wisdom of it, the acceptance of it. And it just made me think about where we are when we're oldish and being able to do all of that, partly because we have to as far as our limitations, I'm putting in quotation marks, but also that's true our whole lives. And earlier in our lives, we're driven to make those goals and make that happen. And I think we tend to be harder on ourselves because we believe we should be able to do fill in the blank. And that maybe the wisdom of oldish is a lifelong lesson of we're part of this. We're part of this story. We're part of this larger piece of life, and that's okay.
I understand that it's not as good as if I had made it, but it is what it is.
It sounds like a really mature decision, though, Chris. I know that it was a hard one to make.
It's an oldish decision.
After you left and went back down, part of the group went on and kept going up. We went up over the top of a glacier, and climbing up the glacier got to a point that I think may have been somewhat comparable, where we got to a rock fall that was 300 meters high, and the trail, such as it involved clambering up over boulders. So there was kind of bouldering up, and the trail was an overstatement. It didn't really seem to be a trail there. And the people in front of me were not oldish, they were young, and the people behind me were not feeling well. So I spent a lot of that 300-meter climb by myself, but it was maybe 18,000 feet. And I got about halfway up there, and I sat down on one of the boulders. And for the first time I can remember ever, I said, I can't go any further. I can't do this anymore. I couldn't breathe. But then I looked around and I said, I'm 150 meters up from a trail that's almost 18,000 feet. And I got another 150 meters to go to get up above 18,000 feet. I can't stop. There's just no way to stop here. And I was able to keep going, I'm glad to say, because it would have been embarrassing to be the dead guy on the side of the trail for the next 40,000 people that walked by. But it was just really hard. And that's where I felt my limitations really. But for the rest of that walk, I was mostly alone on the trail. And that was some of the best alone time I can imagine. I knew there was a team out there and I wasn't in any danger. Looking back on the time that we spent doing the Oldish adventuring for reasons other than our own. Every time I went on a hike or a trip before, it was always because I wanted to. This particular trip was the first big thing that I ever did, other than raising a family, that I did for somebody else. And for many people that I didn't know. More details on the story you can find in the show notes. But we were doing it for thousands of people around the world who had this, whose lives were affected by this debilitating disease. Not just the kids, but the families and the friends and the villages and everybody around this kid. We were doing this climb for them. And that, I think, also made it richer, a much richer experience for me. I wasn't just there by myself. It really had to do with thousands of other people who were in a circumstance that they couldn't do anything about, and they couldn't even dream of being really there. And that made a big difference for me. And certainly, I'll have to say, before we maybe segue on to something else I want to talk to you about, Chris, that was a beginning of what I know will be a lifelong friendship. And as you mentioned earlier, learning from each other that I will treasure pretty much forever.
The only thing I would add is I think I'm happier than I've ever been in my life. That being oldish doesn't mean you lose ground. Being oldish can be that you really gain a lot of ground. And that's how I feel. I feel like my life is richer, more diverse, happier, more satisfied, more all of the good stuff than ever before. And that only makes me look forward to more. I like the way things are going.
Well, that's beautiful, Chris. I'm so glad that we got to talk. Everything you said is inspiring and lovely. I think that that's part of the mission of this podcast, is to bring to our listeners this option that oldish doesn't have to be the end and waiting for the end. It's a time for continued new experiences, continued lifelong experiences, and finding happiness, contentment, and finding the magic.
Yeah. It was nice to meet you, Janet. Chris,
I want to thank you for joining us today. I kind of wish we could, let's just talk every day. It would be wonderful to carry on this conversation and just keep going. But I know that we all have time limits, and our listeners all have time limits. And so we can't keep going all day, every day, starting from now and 24/7. That won't work. But you've done a wonderful job helping me anyway to understand what oldish means from your point of view, not so much by a definition of the term, but just by your behaviors, your attitudes, your beautiful soul, your kindness. And that's all super important. And can't thank you enough for coming on with us today.
Well, thank you. And it's been really a pleasure. And of course, you and I go back a ways, old man, and I hope we go forward a long ways.
Yeah, I think we will. And what you just said about being happy, I've never been this happy before. And I remember specifically in my 40s and 50s, I would start to read things where people said, oh, yeah, now that I'm old, I'm happier than I've ever been. And my response was always, yeah, sure. But now that I'm oldish, it's true. I actually am happier in many ways. And I know that that's not necessarily the case for everybody, but it's a great blessing. As is knowing you, my friend.
And peace and love to everybody.
That's it for now. Thanks for listening. I really enjoyed listening to this episode again as I re-edited it, and I hope you enjoyed it too. I'm working on a memoir to commemorate this and other treks I made with Chris, Everest to End Duchenne, and others, to raise awareness and funds for research to find a cure for Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy. I've started posting excerpts on my Substack. Please check them out. Link in the show notes. Our next episode, to be published next week, is a conversation Janet and I had about traveling while oldish. We learned some things. Our next book club, in a couple weeks, will be a discussion of All the Lonely People by Mike Gale. Can the main character, in his 80s, become oldish? You can leave comments or requests for topics or guests on this or other episodes at www.oldish.me. There's a link there, too, if you've wondered how you can help support our podcast. If you like what you heard today, please tell a friend and rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.